I'd like to welcome Nick Wolf to the stage.
Hello everyone, my name, as you may have guessed, is Nick Wolf. So I am a junior software engineer, currently at Culture Amp. If you haven't heard of Culture Amp, you are already surrounded. Now, for those of you who know me, or for those of you who've interacted with me even briefly, there is one thing that I love above all others, and that is feedback. I am deeply enthusiastic about feedback. How much am I enthusiastic about feedback? I include a link to a feedback form inside my email signature. Now, if that isn't enough to convince you that I like immediate feedback with which to learn, then once a year I also ask all of my very, very generous friends to fill in my feedback birthday form. So this is just an abbreviated version of it. It depends how dedicated you want to be, how many pages of feedback you want to give. The first piece of feedback I ever received from my email was, "You're a wonderful son." That didn't really maintain the anonymity. And the most recent feedback I got was, "You should wear less red." So I'm still learning to wear less red. Now, how can we figure out what our code is doing and get immediate feedback as we're doing it?
Testing.
So testing is also good, but one of the ways that you can learn what your code is doing directly as you're doing it is to use my third favorite gem, which is Pry. So today I will be teaching you, or attempting to teach you, some of the cool things you can do with the Pry gem. Now, what exactly is Pry? So, Pry is a developer console and IRB alternative for Ruby. So what this actually means is that if you are attempting to figure out what a piece of code is doing, rather than building your Ruby app and then having it run through and then either everything works beautifully, which theoretically is possible to happen on the first time, or something goes terribly wrong and you're not quite sure what. So IRB, and in my opinion its superior alternative, Pry, allows you to jump into Ruby and run some methods, run some code, and see what exactly your code is doing as you type it. So to demo that, I will do something generally ill-advised on your first presentation, and I will jump into some live coding. Now, what I've got here is a short little Ruby file. Now, we can see over here, I have this line here, line 40, which does binding.pry. Now, when you have binding.pry inside of your code, it will attempt to run through your code as normal, but as soon as it hits this binding.pry line, it will stop executing your code and then open up a Pry session, which allows you to play around with the code that you are currently running. For anyone who wants to raise issue about the fact that I'm defining 3 separate classes in a single Ruby file here, don't worry, I haven't written any code that bad in at least the last 2 days. Now, if we run this program, we will see that it continues through the code as normal, and then it will stop here at line 40 to show the binding.pry. And we can now interact with all the stuff that has already been completed by the code that's run through so far. So here we can do some basic stuff like 2 plus 2, that will work, thankfully. You can assign variables. That will work. And you can also define new objects. So we can create an array there. So this is similar functionality to IRB, but I did want to show off some of the cooler things that you can do inside of Pry. Now, the first thing is inside of Pry, if we look at the file here, on line 5, I've defined the class car. And we can actually CD into that car. Now, once we're inside that car, we can say, okay, well, let's have a look, and we can run ls, and that will show us some of the class methods. So we can see beep, we can see some of the instance methods, so call shotgun, and it will also tell us about some of the instance variables that have been prepared to be set when you create an instance of this. So for instance, because we are inside this car, we can actually run the beep method, and it will treat it as if it's a local method rather than you having to run car.beep. But maybe you're playing around here and you've forgotten where exactly in the code you are. So you can run where am I, and we see we're inside the car. It's fairly obvious now. Now, here we'll notice that it just has the capital C car to indicate that we're inside the class. Now, in a file directory, and along the same lines here in Pry, if we want to get out of the car, we'll just jump out with cd ... and that takes us back to the main area. In fact, if we do where am I now, it says we've returned back to where we were in the first place. From this line 38, we can see that we've made a cool car, and we can jump inside that cool car as well. Now here we can run show method, and show methods will give us an indication of what is inside this instance. So in this case, what is inside the car instance, and it will tell us some of the details inside here. And once again, we can see this call shotgun. So here we can do shotgun. And once again, it runs that, rather than you having to do cool car, you can run the call shotgun as a local method instead. Now, let's jump out of that car. Another cool feature that you can use inside of Pry is you can actually use it to look at the docs that you have access to. So if I use RI, I can say, well, I'm trying to do a method to do with arrays, but I can't quite remember how it worked. So let me have a look at the docs for array.each. And here it will give me information about how it works. You pass in an item and the block, and it will explain how it will work. A cool thing about Pry is that it will read your Pry RC file. This allows you to do a lot of customization. So for instance, included in my Pry RC file, I've created a new method called toy. So sometimes when you're doing coding, you want to test something on an array, and rather than you saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, etc., by defining this method, you can do array.toy, and then it will just spin you up an array, and you can actually have it be however big it is that you want it to be. And you can also define a similar method on hash. So this is technically monkey patching, but it will only be active inside of your Pry session. So therefore, your code that is being executed on production is never going to interact with these methods. So here we can say, give me a hash that is 5. and then it will give you a nice little hash that you can toy around with and try and figure out, is this going to work in the way I want it to. Now, when you want to finish up with your pry session, so let's just check, where am I? So when you want to exit out of this session, you can just do exit. But at this point, we'll see that I have later on in my code, inside this DHH car rev engine methods, which is inside the GT3, which apparently is an expensive car, we have a loop. Now, inside that loop, it's running 10 times, and each time it is doing this vroom before getting tripped by the binding.pry. Now, the first way you can get out of this is you can exit, but oh no, we're still inside the loop, and it's done its first iteration through the loop with its vroom, but we can't escape this. Let's try again. No, we're still stuck. So there are two ways you can get out of this. The first is if you do exit with an exclamation mark, that will end the entire program. And then poor DHH doesn't get to vroom his car. But there is an alternative, which is you can also do disable pry. Now, disable pry will mean that from now on, it will ignore all binding.pries, which means when we run it, we get lots of vroom, 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 vroom. Now, one other thing that I want to point out is just how comprehensive the pry.rc file can be. So my pry.rc file is quite extensive, and I've tried to collect a number of cool things that you can do by modifying and extending it. So one of the cool things you can do, as Michael has reminded me, is inside pry, you can use VI commands. And also, Jason Hinchcliffe pointed out that you can actually alias the command. So if for some reason you don't like binding.pry, you can use, as is his preferred term, bound lad or bindy.boy. But one thing I wanted to point out, just to indicate the true variability, is one of my favorite tools outside of Pry is a search term, is a fuzzy search, fuzzy history searcher called FZF, and you can actually integrate that into Pry, which means that you can say, I was running a command, it has something to do with array, and you can use this to review all of your history inside of Pry as well, which I find preferable to the standard way of reviewing history inside Pry. Jump back here. So we've demoed CD, where am I, ls, ri, show method, disable pry, how you can set up custom methods inside your pry.rc, and just scratched the surface of what is possible with extensions inside of Pry. Now, if you are keen to find out more, then you can head to github.com/pry. And if you're also curious about my pry.rc file, because I like investing more time than is reasonable in things, you can head to quintrino.files and then check out the pry.rc section. I hope you have enjoyed my talk. And of course, if you have any feedback, you can head to nickwoolf.com.au/feedback, and you can find me at these various other social media points. Thank you.
Will you be taking questions?
I will take some questions. Yes, I reserve the right to say above my pay grade.
I bet I can tell you what the first question is going to be.
Well done, Nick. That was great. I actually have 3 questions. One was answered. One was answered, which is your dot files. I'm going to go and check it out.
All right, perfect.
Second one was obviously the first one that you said, that Pry was your third favourite gem. What are your first and second?
Oh, well, you'll have to wait for my upcoming talks, my friends. You got to sell the sizzle.
That's good. That's good. I'm really looking forward to it. And then the last question was, so I've used Binding Pry a fair bit. I never knew about CD and LS.
Okay.
It's fantastic. How did you come across them, and like, how do you recommend? Because I've looked at the documentation and probably seen it somewhere and just gone, I don't need that. But now that you've shown me, I need that. How did you find it? How did you come across it? How did you learn to use it?
Sure. So I'd say the most valuable resource is on the Pry page on GitHub, where it includes a wiki of some of the commands. But one of the resources that I've actually found the most useful is going through other people's dot files on GitHub, where they will either alias commands, the array.toy and hash.toy have been pilfered from someone else's dot files. So I would say other people's dot files is a good way to see the various customizations you can do with Pry. But yeah, the wiki page on the GitHub repo is generally my first stop. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, excellent talk. I assume you can, but I just thought I'd ask, can you use Pry to replace the built-in IRB in Ruby? Like, because I use IRB a lot for just quickly checking stuff, but I'm not usually in a program at the time.
So from memory, the way that you can do this is as you can have a Pry RC file, you can also have an IRB RC file, and you just have your IRB RC file. The first line is require Pry, and then the second line is start Pry. And then at the bottom, you do exit, which means that when you exit the Pry session, it then runs the remainder of your IRB RC file, which exits you out of IRB.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you, Nick.
Thank you.